He lived in a quiet neighborhood, a place where everyone knew each other by sight, if not by name. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching over the sidewalks, creating patches of shade in the afternoon sun. He had always liked this part of town because it felt safe, familiar, like the world outside could not reach him here. People passed by with casual nods, children played in the yards, and the occasional dog barked in the distance. For the most part, life moved slowly, predictably, and he liked it that way. From the outside, he looked like any other man in the neighborhood. Medium height, fit but not overly muscular, with calm eyes that seemed to watch more than they spoke. His demeanor was quiet, reserved, almost shy, and many neighbors saw him as a polite, hard-working man who kept to himself. He spent his mornings jogging through the streets, greeting a few people here and there, always with a nod and a small smile. Some assumed he was just a man who enjoyed his solitude. They had no idea who he had been, what he had done, or the strength he carried hidden beneath his calm exterior. His house was modest but well kept, a small one-story home with a neat front yard. The garden was his pride, even though he didn't like showing it off. He spent hours tending to the flowers, trimming the bushes, and making sure everything looked just right. There was a sense of order and discipline in the way he managed his life, a precision that others found admirable but could not explain. Every tool had its place, every routine had its reason. On the surface, it was just a man caring for his home. But those who had seen the world he came from would have understood that this was the behavior of someone who had learned to survive under extreme conditions. On a typical weekday, he left the house early. His work required focus, patience, and dedication. He didn't talk much about it because he didn't like attention. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. Sometimes he helped neighbors with small tasks, a leaky faucet, a broken fence, or moving furniture. People liked that about him. They felt safe asking for help because he never judged, never hesitated. He was strong not just in body but in character, and that quiet strength drew people to him even if they didn't fully understand why. Despite the calm of the neighborhood, there were undercurrents of tension that he couldn't ignore. In recent months, he had noticed changes in the area. The friendly greetings from some neighbors had been replaced with nervous glances. Certain streets were avoided after dark. Murmurs of a gang moving through the neighborhood had reached him, whispers of people who caused trouble and targeted families. He didn't need to be told twice. His instincts were sharp. Something was stirring, something dangerous, but he did not react hastily. He had learned long ago that patience was as important as strength, and timing could make the difference between chaos and control. In the evenings, he often sat on the porch, a cup of tea or coffee in hand, watching the world go by. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby yard, and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded him that the world continued, even when troubles were brewing just beyond the horizon. He thought about life, about the choices people made, about the way some people could live quietly while others chased chaos. It was a strange balance, but one he had come to accept. He had neighbors who respected him, even if they did not know the whole truth. A middle-aged woman who lived across the street would occasionally wave and chat about her garden. A young couple down the lane asked for advice on painting their home. He was approachable, friendly when needed, but never overly familiar. He had learned that boundaries were important. People often made assumptions based on appearances, and he knew the dangers of underestimating someone. He had spent too many years being underestimated to make that mistake again, and yet he wanted nothing more than to live quietly. The world had been harsh before, filled with battles he no longer wanted to fight openly. He had fought for his country, for ideals larger than himself, and had seen things most people could not imagine. His training had shaped him, molded him into someone extraordinary, someone capable of surviving impossible situations. But he had chosen to walk away, to live as a man among others, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and in his own way, free. Even with the calm around him, he noticed signs that the tension in the neighborhood was growing. A car parked too long in front of a house, unfamiliar faces lingering at night, the faint sound of shouting carried on the wind. He did not act immediately. He observed, quietly taking mental notes. Every step, every glance, every movement mattered. He had learned that when danger approached, it often came in subtle ways first, and now he could feel it creeping closer, a shadow stretching across the peaceful street he had grown to love. One evening, while returning from a jog, he noticed new graffiti on the walls of a nearby abandoned building, words meant to intimidate, to mark territory. It was crude, hateful, and left a pit in his stomach. He understood what it meant. A gang had started making their presence known, and his home, his life, could very easily become a target. A sense of unease settled in his chest, but he did not panic. Panic was for those who were unprepared. He had been ready for situations like this in ways most could never imagine, though he hoped it would never come to that. He spent that night on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Memories of the past came unbidden, training exercises, missions, fights he had survived. Each memory reminded him of the strength he carried, the skills he had earned through pain and discipline. He did not boast, he did not need to. Strength was not about showing off. It was about readiness, control, and the ability to protect what mattered. And his home, his life, his peace, they all mattered. The next few days passed with a tense quiet. He kept his routines, careful to maintain appearances. He did small repairs around the house, trimmed the garden, went for his runs, and even helped a neighbor carry groceries. To anyone watching, life seemed normal, even idyllic. But beneath the calm surface, he was alert, attentive, ready. He watched the neighborhood, noting changes, familiar faces that now seemed strange, and strange faces that lingered too long. His instincts whispered warnings, and though he wanted to ignore them, he knew better. The storm was coming, and he could feel it approaching with every subtle sign. He also began to notice a certain recklessness among the younger people who now roamed the streets in small groups. They were loud, careless, testing boundaries, leaving trails of disrespect in their wake. It was clear that someone, or a group, was trying to assert control, claiming the neighborhood as their own. Most people ignored it or were too afraid to react, but he was not most people. He felt a responsibility not out of duty to the world, but out of care for the life he had built, for the peace he had fought to maintain. At night, he lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city, thinking about the years he had left behind him. He remembered every lesson, every hardship, and every triumph. He remembered the discipline it had taken to survive in circumstances most would never endure. And as he lay there, he made a silent promise. If his life, his home, his peace were threatened, he would respond. Not with rage, not with recklessness, but with precision. He would protect what he had, and those who sought to destroy it would learn, too late, that they had awakened something far greater than they expected. But for now, he waited. He lived quietly. He smiled at passing neighbors, nodded at friends, and maintained the illusion of normalcy. Because in the days ahead, when the shadow arrived, when the gang finally crossed the line, they would not know what they had unleashed. They would see only the calm exterior, the ordinary man, unaware that beneath it all lay the strength, the skill, and the resolve of someone who had survived far greater storms. And so, life continued, deceptively calm in the quiet neighborhood with oak trees lining the streets, where a man lived simply, yet prepared for the unimaginable. The calm before the storm was heavy, tense, but in his mind it was nothing more than a moment of preparation. The night came quietly, with a heavy stillness that made the street seem almost unreal. Streetlights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside his home, he was finishing dinner, the soft hum of a fan the only sound besides the ticking clock. He had noticed a few unusual signs earlier in the day, strangers lingering near the corners of the street, the distant echo of laughter that seemed out of place, and the faint sound of cars driving slowly past as if watching, waiting. His instincts whispered that something was coming, but he did not want to believe it. He hoped it was nothing, that the peaceful neighborhood he cherished would remain untouched. He cleaned the dishes and moved to the living room, stretching and letting out a quiet sigh. The soft glow from the lamp highlighted the calm in the room, the neatness he had worked so hard to maintain. Everything was in its place, everything orderly. That was the way he liked it, peace, routine, and control. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, and for a moment it seemed that the world would continue as it always had. But then he heard it, a faint, deliberate noise at the back of the house, a sound that did not belong, a whisper of destruction in the night. At first he froze, listening carefully. His mind ran through possibilities, calculating, assessing. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too purposeful to be an animal. The sound of breaking glass came next, soft but unmistakable. Someone was inside his property. Someone who meant to cause harm. His heart did not race, but his senses sharpened. Every muscle, every instinct, every memory of training he had tried to leave behind surged forward. He moved quietly, almost like a shadow, toward the window to look outside. Through the dim light, he saw them. A group of men moving with aggression and disregard, smashing the fence and stepping onto his lawn. They wore masks, but the anger in their posture, the way they tore at the surroundings, was clear. His house, the home he had built with care and peace, was being violated. They were throwing objects, breaking doors, shattering windows, leaving threatening marks on the walls. He could feel the surge of rage and disbelief, but he did not act rashly. Acting rashly would be a mistake. He had survived far worse by staying calm, by observing, by choosing the right moment to respond. He watched for a few moments, taking note of every movement, every weapon, every sign of weakness. They thought they were powerful, that he was helpless, that they could intimidate him. They did not know him at all. Their laughter echoed harshly in the night as they tore through the living room, scattering furniture, breaking lamps, overturning tables. A sense of violation washed over him, but he suppressed it. Anger was natural, but it was dangerous if uncontrolled. He had learned that years ago. The gang moved through the house like a storm, careless and reckless, leaving destruction in their wake. They did not realize that every sound they made, every step they took, was being observed by someone far more capable than they could imagine. He could track their positions, anticipate their moves, and remain undetected. The calmness he maintained was not fear, it was strategy. While they believed they held the power, he held the advantage. Then came a moment that made him pause briefly. One of them stepped toward his bedroom, looking around with a sense of entitlement. He had a split second to decide what to do, and he chose observation. Every movement, every subtle detail, every piece of their behavior told him everything he needed to know. They were skilled at intimidation, but they were untrained, inexperienced in real confrontation. That would be their downfall. He did not rush. He never rushed. Precision always mattered more than speed. He quietly slipped out of the room and moved toward the back door. Outside, the night air was cool, the scent of wet earth and broken grass filling his lungs. He listened to their voices, muffled shouts and harsh laughter, and he could tell the tension among them was rising. Not all of them were confident. Some hesitated, looking around nervously, sensing an edge to the night they had not anticipated. He made mental notes, cataloging their positions, the order in which they moved, and their level of alertness. Despite the danger, there was a strange clarity in his mind. He was not scared. He was prepared. The skills he had honed over years of training, the awareness, the patience, the discipline, were all coming back in perfect alignment. He could feel the strength in his body, the sharpness of his reflexes, the ability to anticipate danger. It was a power he had not used for a long time, one he had set aside in pursuit of a quiet life. But tonight it was necessary. The gang's leader, a man with an air of arrogance, began to shout commands, pushing the others to be faster, to destroy more. They were confident, blinded by their assumption that no one could stop them. Their confidence was their weakness. He watched as they moved deeper into the house, unaware that they were being studied, that every misstep would be noted. One by one, he began to plan their undoing, calculating the safest and most effective way to neutralize the threat without putting himself at unnecessary risk. As the chaos continued inside, he quietly returned to the living room window and observed their faces, their hands, the tools they wielded. There was fear in some, excitement in others, a mix of adrenaline and arrogance that made them predictable. He realized that they did not expect resistance, that their overconfidence would give him the upper hand when he chose to act. For now, observation was enough. Acting too soon could ruin everything. He needed precision, patience, control, the same qualities that had kept him alive in situations far more dangerous than this. The gang continued their rampage, moving to his kitchen and tearing through drawers, throwing objects and laughing at the destruction. They mocked the home as if it were nothing more than a toy to them. He could feel the frustration building, but he kept it under control. He knew that letting anger dictate his actions would be a mistake. He allowed them to think they had the advantage, to believe that their attack had succeeded. Every second they spent inside the house, unaware of his awareness, brought him closer to the moment he could strike back. At one point, he noticed one of them attempting to look into a safe. He had long forgotten to hide properly. His eyes narrowed, but he stayed calm. He did not need to confront them physically yet. He merely observed, noting their approach and planning how to respond. He knew the exact point to intervene, where his presence would be decisive, and he prepared himself mentally. This was not a fight born out of anger. It was a fight born out of necessity, of protecting what he had built and cherished. Outside, the night remained quiet, except for the sounds coming from inside. Occasionally, a neighbor's dog barked and a car passed by slowly, but no one intervened. It was just another night in a neighborhood unaware of the real danger unfolding. The gang believed they were in control, unaware that the man they sought to intimidate was not ordinary at all. He had survived situations most people could not imagine, trained to endure, to fight, to think ahead when every second counted. Tonight, all of that experience would come into play. Hours seemed to pass in moments. The gang, now tired and careless, began to argue among themselves. One suggested leaving before they were caught. Another insisted on finishing the destruction. Their indecision made them weaker, more predictable. He continued to watch, his mind running calculations, preparing for the perfect moment to act. He did not need to rush. The longer he waited, the more mistakes they made, the more advantage he gained. Then, as the night reached its deepest hour, the moment came. One of the men stepped out into the hall, turning their back. Another reached for something heavy. He moved silently, almost like a shadow, positioning himself with care. He did not strike out of anger. He struck out of precision. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, and effective. The first man stumbled, caught off guard, and the others spun around, surprised at the sudden presence of someone they thought powerless. The room erupted into confusion. Their confidence shattered instantly. He moved with speed and accuracy, disarming threats, neutralizing aggression, and regaining control of the situation. They had underestimated him completely, and that mistake would cost them dearly. Panic replaced their arrogance, and he used it to his advantage. Each action was calculated, ensuring minimal harm to himself while stopping the threat efficiently. By the time the gang realized what had happened, the damage had shifted. They were no longer in control. He was. Their confidence replaced by fear, they stumbled, tried to escape, but he had already anticipated their every move. His quiet calm had become a storm they could not withstand. What they had thought would be a night of destruction had become a lesson in underestimating someone. He did not boast, did not celebrate. He merely ensured that the threat was ended and that his home, the place he loved, was protected. When the chaos finally subsided, the night was silent again. The house bore signs of the intrusion, broken objects, scattered furniture, but the threat had been neutralized. He moved through the home, checking corners, ensuring that everyone who meant harm was no longer a danger. Relief washed over him, but he did not linger. He had survived the storm, controlled the situation, and now it was time to prepare for what might come next. He knew this was only the beginning. They had underestimated him once, but he could not be sure they would not return. For now, he allowed himself a moment of calm, tending to minor repairs, securing what remained and ensuring the house was safe. His mind was alert, planning, anticipating, ready for the next challenge. He had survived the night, and in doing so, he had reminded himself that the skills, strength, and discipline he carried were never lost. They had only been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The morning after the attack, the neighborhood seemed to breathe with a cautious calm, as if even the trees and streets had sensed the tension of the night before. He woke early, before sunrise, the faint orange light creeping through the blinds. His body moved with ease, stretching and taking in the quiet around him. The previous night's chaos still weighed on his mind, but not with panic or fear, only with focus. He knew what had happened and what could happen. The attack had been deliberate, violent, and meant to intimidate. But they had underestimated him, and that mistake would not be repeated. He walked slowly through the house, surveying the damage. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and scuffed walls told the story of the gang's intrusion. He did not feel despair, only the resolve to act. The house was his sanctuary, and even though the night had tested it, it had not been defeated. He moved carefully, noting the paths they had taken, the items they had touched, and the careless mistakes they had made. Every detail mattered. In his mind, He began cataloging it all: patterns, weaknesses, the overconfidence that had led them to this moment. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a flashback, one that reminded him why he was not an ordinary man. Years ago, he had trained in some of the most demanding conditions imaginable. His time in the Navy SEALs had been grueling, pushing his body and mind beyond limits most could not even imagine. He had learned to stay calm in chaos, to think clearly when everyone else panicked, and to survive situations where others would fail. Those lessons were etched into every movement, every thought, every instinct. It was not about strength alone, it was about discipline, awareness, and precision. He remembered the early mornings before missions, when the world was still dark and quiet. He remembered running through rain-soaked fields, swimming through icy waters, climbing cliffs with nothing but determination, and practicing scenarios over and over until every action became automatic. Every muscle, every reflex, every instinct had been trained to respond in perfect coordination. He remembered missions where a single misstep could cost lives, and the focus required in those moments. It was a life he had chosen, a path that demanded sacrifice and discipline, but he had left it all behind, seeking a life of quiet, a life where he could be a man without a uniform, without orders, without enemies around every corner. Now, that past was returning to him, not as a choice but as a necessity. The gang had tested him and they had failed to understand who they were dealing with. He realized that their recklessness, their arrogance, and their ignorance had given him the advantage. They had believed in fear, in intimidation, but they had not faced someone who could calculate, anticipate, and act with absolute precision. He did not feel pride. He felt readiness. The skills he had carried for years were still inside him, dormant but not diminished. And tonight he would begin to use them, not to destroy recklessly, but to protect and reclaim what was his. He moved through the house, checking every lock, every window, and every possible point of entry. He repaired what he could with his hands, using careful, deliberate motions. There was no rush, no panic, only methodical preparation. He set up small changes, subtle reinforcements that might go unnoticed but would give him control. He thought about the gang, how they had moved, how they had acted, and how they would react if confronted. He began creating a mental map of the situation, anticipating their mistakes, their assumptions, and their overconfidence. For hours he worked quietly, repairing the house, cleaning the mess, and preparing himself. Each task became a meditation, a way to sharpen his mind while strengthening his environment. His movements were fluid, precise, almost automatic, a reflection of years of discipline. He did not talk to anyone. He did not need to. The world outside could wait while he prepared. Every moment of calm was a moment of power being regained, a moment to ensure that when the time came, he would be ready. As the day progressed, he began to gather intelligence, subtle and careful. He spoke to neighbors indirectly, asking small, innocent questions about what they had noticed, who had been around, and what strange occurrences they had seen. No one suspected his true intentions. No one imagined the depth of his awareness. They were unaware that he had already studied the gang's behavior, that he had noted their patterns, and that he could predict their next moves. He was patient, waiting for the right moment, understanding that timing would be critical in ensuring success. He thought about the gang themselves, their overconfidence, their arrogance, and their lack of preparation. They believed in numbers, in fear, and chaos, but they did not understand the strength of discipline, training, and focus. They assumed he was weak, vulnerable, a man who could be intimidated. They were wrong. He could see it clearly now. Each mistake they had made, each misjudgment that would soon cost them. The calm that he maintained was not passivity. It was control, awareness, and strategy. Throughout the day, he reflected on his own life, on the choice he had made to leave the Navy SEALs behind. He remembered the desire for peace, for a life that was ordinary, for mornings when he could enjoy the quiet without danger lurking at every corner. That life had been interrupted, but he understood that strength came with responsibility. He had been tested before, and he had survived because he had learned the importance of control, patience, and calculated action. Tonight, those lessons would be put into practice once more. By evening, the neighborhood had fallen into a quiet rhythm. Streetlights flickered on, and the soft sounds of distant traffic and occasional dog barks filled the air. He sat for a moment on his porch looking out at the familiar street, the homes he had walked past for years and the neighbors who had no idea of the storm brewing in his mind. He sipped his tea slowly, feeling a clarity that only comes with preparation and purpose. He had accepted that confrontation was inevitable. It was not a question of if, but when, and when it came, he would be ready. He began planning in detail. He thought about the gang's numbers, their likely strategies, and the errors they had made the night before. He considered the environment, the layout of his home, and the tools at his disposal. Every element mattered, every possibility was calculated, and every response was measured. His training had taught him to think ahead, to anticipate danger, and to act with precision. Now he was putting those skills into practice, not in a classroom, not in a mission, but in the place he valued most, his home. He reviewed the previous night's events in his mind, step by step. He recalled the positions of each intruder, their reactions and their weaknesses. He considered how they would act if they returned, how fear and overconfidence would influence their decisions, and how he could exploit that to his advantage. It was not a matter of brute force. It was a matter of strategy, patience, and mental clarity. Each calculation brought him closer to the moment when he would reclaim control, not just of his home, but of the situation that had threatened his life. He also reflected on the human side of the situation. This was not just about strength or skill. It was about justice, about protecting his life, his home, and the peace he had fought to build. He did not want unnecessary harm, but he would not tolerate threats. He understood the balance between force and restraint, between action and observation, and he was prepared to act when necessary. His mind was calm, his body ready, and his resolve firm. As night approached, he began to make subtle preparations around the house. Windows were checked, doors reinforced, and potential weak points identified. He moved with quiet efficiency, ensuring that he could control access and anticipate movement. It was not about fear, it was about control. He had lived through situations far more dangerous, situations where precision and patience were the difference between life and death. Tonight he would apply those lessons not with recklessness but with calculated effectiveness. By the time darkness fully settled, he was ready. He moved through the house silently, reviewing plans, anticipating threats, and preparing for action. His body was alert, his mind focused, and his instincts sharp. The calm exterior he maintained belied the storm of preparation within. He understood that the gang had assumed he was vulnerable, that they had underestimated him completely. They did not know that beneath his quiet demeanor lay the strength, skill, and experience of someone who had survived the unimaginable. He sat for a moment in the living room, listening to the night. Every sound, every creak of the house, every distant noise was a clue, a signal, a reminder that vigilance was necessary. He did not feel fear. He felt readiness. The attack had awakened something within him, a clarity of purpose and a recognition that his past, his training, and his discipline had not been wasted. They were tools, weapons, and shields that would ensure he maintained control. And so, he waited. Not out of hesitation, not out of uncertainty, but with patience, strategy, and awareness. He had learned that the most effective power often comes not from immediate action, but from preparation, observation, and the precise timing of response. Tonight he would act, and when he did, the gang would see the difference between underestimating someone and challenging a man who had been forged in fire, tested in battle, and trained to survive against all odds. The night arrived with a heavy calm, the kind of quiet that carried a sense of anticipation. He moved through his home like a shadow, silent and deliberate. Every object, every corner, every pathway had been considered. His preparation over the past day had transformed the familiar spaces of his house into a controlled environment, a place where he had the advantage. The gang had thought they could intimidate him, that they could break his home and spirit. They were wrong. Now it was his turn to regain control, and he would do it with precision and patience. He began by observing from the shadows, waiting for the signs of the gang's return. He knew they would come back eventually. They had tasted fear, destruction, and arrogance, and that combination often brought people to strike twice. He positioned himself in a way that allowed him to see entrances, pathways, and the points where they were most likely to make mistakes. He had learned long ago that control of space was as important as strength, and tonight he would use that knowledge fully. Hours passed in silence. The faint sounds of distant traffic, a barking dog, and the occasional wind through the trees were the only interruptions. He remained calm, focused, and alert. His mind cataloged every potential movement, every path, every reaction the intruders might take. He remembered the chaos of the previous night, the arrogance and recklessness of the gang, and he smiled faintly. They had left clues, patterns, and weaknesses, and now he was turning them into his advantage. When the gang arrived, it was not with caution, but with the same careless confidence they had shown before. They moved in groups, whispering among themselves, mocking the empty streets, thinking they could strike without consequence. But he had changed the balance. He did not reveal himself immediately. He let them make mistakes, misstep, and expose themselves. Each movement they made gave him more information, more control. Patience was his weapon, and he wielded it silently. As they approached the house, one of them kicked at the gate carelessly. Another threw a glance toward a window he had reinforced. Their arrogance was thick, and it made them predictable. He noted their positions, their spacing, and the likely errors their overconfidence would create. Every step they took was being measured, catalogued, and stored for the right moment. He did not feel fear or anger. He felt focus. The chaos that had once threatened his home now became a tool, a means of turning their strength against them. Inside the house, he moved with the precision of someone who had been trained to survive situations far more dangerous than this. His steps were quiet, deliberate, almost like a dance. He used shadows to his advantage, staying unseen while observing every detail. He knew where they would move, how they would react, and what mistakes they were likely to make. His mind ran calculations constantly, anticipating every possible scenario. The calm that enveloped him was a weapon, one that the gang could not even begin to understand. When the first man entered through the back door, he did not strike immediately. Instead, he allowed the intruder to move forward, making sure each step would lead to a controlled outcome. The man tripped over an object that had been carefully placed, falling to the floor with a startled shout. The others froze, surprised and off balance. That moment of confusion gave him the upper hand. He struck quickly, not with unnecessary force, but with precision that left the intruder incapacitated and unable to continue the attack. The rest of the gang panicked. They shouted, tried to regroup, but every movement was anticipated. He moved from shadow to shadow, controlling the environment, using the confusion to his advantage. He disarmed threats before they could act, neutralized aggression without unnecessary harm, and guided the chaotic energy of the intruders into outcomes that were entirely under his control. The fear that began to creep into their voices was a sign that they were finally realizing their mistake. Their arrogance had been their weakness, and he exploited it at every turn. He anticipated the leader's movements, predicting where he would go next, how he would react to the chaos, and how he would try to regain control. Every decision he made was calculated, deliberate, and precise. It was not about rage or vengeance, it was about restoring order and protecting what was his. The intruders were no longer in control, he was. The tables had turned completely, and the difference in skill, awareness, and preparation was now obvious. One of the gang members tried to flee through a window. He intercepted quietly, blocking the path, and guided him back into the center of the house where he could control the situation. Another reached for a weapon, but it was already too late. He had disarmed him with a movement so smooth and precise that it seemed almost effortless. Every action was deliberate, measured, and effective. He did not strike recklessly. He struck efficiently, ending threats while minimizing harm. Each intruder realized too late that they had misjudged the man they thought was weak. The leader of the gang now faced him directly. The room was tense, every shadow heavy with anticipation. But he remained calm, standing in a way that conveyed authority without arrogance. He did not shout or threaten. His presence alone communicated control. The leader, filled with panic and disbelief, realized the mistake they had made. Their previous attacks had been met with a man who did not panic, who did not react blindly, and who had the skill and awareness to neutralize them effectively. The confrontation was brief, but decisive. The leader attempted to assert control, but each move was countered with precision. He disarmed threats, guided movements, and maintained absolute awareness. There was no unnecessary violence, only the enforcement of control and the protection of his home. Within moments, the gang's confidence had evaporated, replaced by fear and submission. They were no longer the aggressors. They were the ones being contained, measured, and neutralized. When the immediate danger was over, he moved through the house again, ensuring that every intruder had been incapacitated or driven away. The room bore signs of conflict, but the threat had been neutralized. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm after the intensity. The intruders had believed they were in control, but he had shown them the reality of underestimating someone trained, disciplined, and prepared. It was not about cruelty. It was about survival, control, and the restoration of order. He checked the perimeter of the house, making sure no one remained. Windows, doors, and entry points were secure once more. Every move he made was deliberate, ensuring that the environment was entirely under his control. He did not celebrate or boast. He simply restored order. The neighborhood remained quiet, the world outside unaware of the confrontation that had just occurred. The intruders had been taught a lesson in misjudging him, and they would not soon forget it. After securing the house, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the past, about the training, about the discipline that had allowed him to handle the situation without losing control. He did not feel pride or arrogance, only clarity. His skills had served their purpose, not for destruction, but for protection. The house, the neighborhood, and his peace had been preserved. He had acted with precision, control, and humanity. He moved slowly through the home, repairing minor damages and ensuring that everything was in order. Broken objects were replaced or moved, furniture rearranged, and the house restored as best as possible. The process was methodical, almost meditative, reinforcing his sense of control. He had faced chaos and emerged intact, not because of luck, but because of preparation, awareness, and discipline. Every step, every decision, every movement had been deliberate. As the night deepened, he finally allowed himself to sit quietly in the living room. The house was safe once more. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware of the storm that had been averted. Inside, he felt a calm that came only after focus and action had been applied. He had protected his home, his sanctuary, and his peace. The intruders had learned a harsh lesson about underestimating someone who had lived through far more dangerous situations. He reflected on what had happened, understanding that strength alone was not enough. It was awareness, preparation, and patience that had given him the advantage. The gang had been reckless, arrogant, and careless, and he had used those traits against them with precision. He had acted not out of anger, but out of necessity. The house, his life, and his peace had been defended successfully, and the intruders had been shown the consequences of their choices. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not pride, not arrogance, but calm clarity. The night had tested him, but he had met the challenge fully. He knew that future challenges might come, but he was ready. He had relied on his skills, his awareness, and his training, and it had been enough. The house, the neighborhood, and his life were safe once more. He rose and moved to the porch, looking out at the quiet street. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a sense of peace and relief. The night was calm, the danger gone for now, but he knew that vigilance would always be necessary. He had acted decisively, precisely, and effectively, and the lesson had been delivered. Those who underestimated him would not do so again. And for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the quiet, the calm, and the sense of control he had regained. The morning after the confrontation was quiet, almost peaceful in a way that made him pause for a moment. The night had been intense, full of danger, precision, and adrenaline, but now the world seemed to have returned to its normal rhythm. Birds chirped softly outside. A light breeze moved through the trees, and the neighborhood began to wake as neighbors stepped out for their routines. He stood in the living room looking at the house. The chaos of the past days was fading, replaced by calm. His home had been defended, the intruders repelled, and he could finally allow himself a moment to reflect. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, adjusting furniture, and quietly tidying where possible. Broken glass had,